heading south of the Mason-Dixon. This is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is your host, Brian McClanahan, and this is episode 300, covering the week of March 7th through March 11th, 2022. Very glad to have you back on the program. I'm excited to be here. It's hard to believe we've done this 300 times, but here we are. So over the last 6 years or so, we've done a podcast once a week, and we've done it 300 times. If you've gotten all 300, thank you for being here for the ride for 300 podcasts. If you're new to the show, make sure you go out to abbevilleinstitute.org, give us that email address, get the free ebook, Exploring the Southern Tradition by 20 Abbeville Institute scholars. You can donate there. Just click on that donate button. We do exist on your generous contributions alone. So if you like the podcast, if you like our website, if you like our programs, if you like our webinars, if you like all the things we do, which we're doing more, and I'll talk some more about that, then you want to give us a little cash because we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. So all of your money is tax deductible to the full extent of the law that you donate to us. So that's a wonderful thing. You can also, while you're there at abbevilleinstitute.org, click on various social media accounts, Gab, Twitter, YouTube. Our YouTube account is great. We're now uploading the lectures from the 2021 summer school, so you can see those. That took place July of last year. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff there, too. Our lectures are Abbeville U videos, which we've got some exciting videos, I think, coming up this year for those, too. So we're doing a lot of stuff, and, of course, you are a big part of that as you listen to this podcast, as you go to the website, as you make those donations. Also, click on the Shop tab, get your high-quality embroidered Abbeville Institute logo material. Great stuff. And as always, rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Let people know you're thinking about it. Let people know you enjoy the Southern tradition. Let people know that you like what we do. Share it around on social media. We're not on Facebook anymore, but you can share these podcasts. You can share our articles on Facebook if you've got a personal Facebook account. Head on over to Gab, though. Subscribe to Gab. It's a nice social media account. It's a lot like Twitter and Facebook together. And so like us over there, and you can follow our material at Gab and share it around there, too. So a lot of great stuff going on at the Institute. We're really excited about 2022. We've been on 3 months now, but we've done our webinars this year, several of them. We've got 2 in March. So our next one is March 15th. There still is time, if you're listening to this podcast before March 15th, to get in on that. If you miss any of our webinars, go to abbevilleacademy.org. You can pick up any of those old webinars there. They're $15 to get the replay, but the webinars are $10 to attend if you get them live. So you pay a little bit more for the hosting services and everything else, but they're wonderful. We've done over a dozen of these things. March 15th, we've got Ryan Walters, who has written a book for the Abbeville Press on Grover Cleveland. He's going to talk about Warren Harding. He has a new book out on Warren Harding with Regnery History, and then, of course, he has his book on Cleveland with the Abbeville Institute Press. So that's another great thing. Our press is wonderful. We've got our free mobile app. You can download that off the website. We've got our Abbeville Academy. Also, if you're getting this before March 15th, if you're an undergraduate, and it might be a little too late to put this together completely, but if you're an undergraduate student and you want some cash for college, you can get that Douglas Rogers essay contest submission going, and you can perhaps win some cash for college. So we've got a lot of great stuff out there that the Institute does. Let me talk about some things we're doing for 2022 before I get into the material for the week. One thing we are doing this year is we're working on something called the 1607 Project. We're going to title it Virginia First, but the idea is to produce a series of essays and a website and a documentary putting Virginia in proper context, putting the Southern tradition in the proper context of the experience, the American experience, the experience of the United States, and how that really matters. Virginia is important. 1619, in fact, is important, but not because of what the 1619 Project focuses the attention on, but because we had our first representative government in America in 1619. We had the first real Thanksgiving in America in 1619 for the English, right? So I know there was a Spanish Thanksgiving before that. People in Florida get very upset about this when I say this, but the first English Thanksgiving, 1619. But that representative government means something, and Virginia is responsible for that. We've got so much to talk about in that project, and it's going to be a wonderful thing. If you want to donate for that, you can donate that way too. Just send us a donation online. You can mail us a check. All of our contact information is available on the website, so that's a wonderful thing. We've got several of these Abbeville U videos going to be produced this year on some pretty interesting topics, so we're excited about that. And our summer school now is coming up. It'll be July 5th through 8th, 2022 at Seabrook Island, South Carolina, so we've got that. And we're planning, right now, I can't say too much about it, but I think we're going to have a pretty big event in the fall of this year, so be on the lookout for that. And more webinars. We've got 2 in March. We got another one at the end of the month, and one already set up for April. So on some pretty interesting topics. So we're really excited about the future of the Institute, and we want you along for the ride. 300 episodes. We've done this 300 times, 300 weeks. We've been doing it since 2015, and I mean it's just been great. So I appreciate all of your time and all of your energy and effort and attention to what we do. We do exist because you like what we do, and that's very important to us. So let me talk about the material I have for the week. In fact, two of the articles this week go back to things we've done in the past. So the first is titled "The Preacher Who Stole Lincoln's Past by the Carload." And this is a really interesting piece. It's by Kevin Orland Johnson, who did our webinar with us back in February on Lincoln. And the title of that webinar was Lincoln Sold Slaves. And you can get his new book, and it includes a chapter on that very topic, Abraham Lincoln Selling Slaves. He has provided, I think, pretty conclusive evidence that Lincoln did sell slaves. Lincoln was involved in the estate sale of several slaves from Robert Smith Todd's estate, and he managed that estate for his wife, or part of the estate for his wife. So Lincoln was certainly fine with selling slaves then. He could have taken the slaves and then emancipated them, but Lincoln didn't do that. He was fine with selling them. But this particular story that Johnson outlines here is the story of documents that are gone. What happened to all of these Lincoln documents that are cited in places, that are brought up? What happened to all of that stuff? What happened to all of these things that historians, Lincoln scholars, go out and they cite or they talk about that nobody can find anymore? Well, this is a story of a man named Reverend Barton that stole all this stuff. He also talks about Lincoln's son burning records. You see, the myth of Abraham Lincoln is created in part because we don't have a complete picture of Lincoln's life. We have what people wanted us to see about Lincoln's life, but not everything that's there about Lincoln's life. For example, the story from Bledsoe, where he actually had to teach Lincoln how to use a broadsword to duel. From my understanding, no one has really brought that up in any of these mainstream accounts of Abraham Lincoln, that you have this guy who wrote the definitive study on secession and whether it was legal or not, Albert Taylor Bledsoe, in the post-war period, teaching Lincoln, who he was friends with Lincoln, how to duel. And that's an amazing thing, right? So the story of Lincoln is not necessarily complete, and though you have all kinds of, more books have been written about Lincoln than anyone else in American history. Anyone. There's a new book about Abraham Lincoln just about every day of the week. So thousands of books have been written about Abraham Lincoln, thousands. And yet so many of these books just regurgitate things that we don't think, or we don't have any conclusive proof these things are true. And as Johnson points out, there's a lot of Lincoln materials out there that nobody's even looked at. They're just stashed away somewhere. And so he is meticulous. Dr. Johnson's meticulous, and he goes out and tries to source everything, every claim that's been made. He's trying to source these things about Lincoln. And he's found a lot of roadblocks. The documents don't exist. He's had people at archives tell him, well, yeah, we know that document doesn't exist. Well, then why do people still cite it? Because somebody cited it in another book, but how do we know they didn't make it up themselves? We know, at least he believes, that Barton was fabricating evidence to try to defend his positions. And so some of these things have ended up in private collectors' hands, so nobody can see these things anymore. Maybe they've been lost over time, burnt. A lot of it, as he mentions, is people wanted autographs. So they would get a Lincoln document, they would cut out the autograph and throw the rest away. So some of that material is gone. He talks about the collected works of Abraham Lincoln, the Bassler collected works of Abraham Lincoln. Even Bassler himself says, well, I can't find, there's so much stuff that's missing. There's so many things that are missing. We don't have all this stuff. It's gone. Where is it? Well, it could be in private collectors' hands. It could have just been stolen and lost. Could have been burned. Who knows? But there's so much stuff about Lincoln that is unknown, and yet we supposedly have this complete picture of Lincoln. He studied more than anyone else, but yet Lincoln has become a mythical figure. There is a myth of Lincoln. There is a myth of the righteous cause. There is a myth of the Honorable Abraham Lincoln. All of this is a myth. More of a myth than the lost cause myth that people talk about. It's more of a myth than that. It's more of a myth because there is a protection of that at large by the United States across sections and across the decades. Whereas the lost cause myth is now attacked on a regular basis. No one attacks the Lincoln myth, as they should. Some people bring it up. Even the 1619 Project at first was critical of Abraham Lincoln. It was based entirely on some work by Phil Magnus. What's amazing about that is Phil Magnus is very critical of the 1619 Project for other reasons, not because of that, but for some other things, namely their discussion of capitalism and slavery. There's a whole caveat to that. But when they found out that he was the one that essentially wrote the story of Lincoln supporting colonization up until almost the day he died, they stopped promoting it, and they went in a different direction. Politics, ideology. They didn't like the fact they were being attacked by Magnus, so they weren't going to support his work, even though they supported it and they agreed with it early on. It's kind of interesting how that works. But the 1619 Project had a pretty complex view of Lincoln. And this is why some people on the right get very upset when we criticize Lincoln, because they're saying, well, you're just doing what the left does. No, I mean, we're doing what Southerners have done since the time Lincoln was elected, even before that. No one trusted Lincoln because he told stories. In a lot of ways, you can look at Lincoln like Joe Biden. Joe Biden tells some tall tales. Lincoln did too, and no one believed them. This is why he was known as Honest Abe. He wasn't very honest. Joe Biden's not honest. Abraham Lincoln's not honest. And so you have that part of it too, and I think that's the interesting part of this story of Lincoln. And it was great to have Dr. Johnson on to talk about this. You can get that lecture on Abbeville Academy, abbevilleacademy.org. It's free to sign up. You just have to buy the lectures, but there's over a dozen there now, and we'll have more. We're going to keep adding more to that. So look for those in that email. When you give us that email address, get that free ebook. That email that address is vital for us because it's how we keep in contact with you. It's how we let you know things are happening. It's more important than social media. That email address it's gold to us. So please give us that email address and stay in contact with us. It's important that goes on. So this Lincoln myth, again, is vital for understanding America because it is a distortion of the American past. But yet we're often told that the South is distorting the American past. And if you go out and look at the comments on our material, you'll see it. Well, the South is the reason. The South is the armpit of America. It's the reason America's been bad for over 200 years. Well, I could say it's the other way around, in fact. That often the critiques that we have of modern American society have been addressed by Southerners for a long time. I remember reading I'll Take My Stand and talking to some people about that back when I was in my early 20s. And there was a hippie guy that I knew, and he was real leftist, but he said he loved that book. And he loved that book because it was a stinging critique of American consumer culture. It's a stinging critique of the fusion of government and finance capital. It's a Jeffersonian critique of what's going on in America in the 1930s. And they followed up with Who Owns America, which is a fantastic book as well. In fact, better than I'll Take My Stand in many ways. A more prescriptive book than I'll Take My Stand. But this was the Southern critique of modernity. And so when you read these books and you go out and say, well, gosh, Southerners have been saying there's this going to happen, consumerism is going to do this, industrialization is going to do this. We're seeing it. We're seeing the byproduct of all those things. They were warning about this 80 years ago. In fact, Jefferson was warning about it, and the Jeffersonians, people like John Taylor of Caroline, were warning about it back in the early 19th century. They were talking about these things. I remember when we had Occupy Wall Street, when George W. Bush was in office. Occupy Wall Street. We're going to have this back in the early 2000s. These people were critical of the influence Wall Street had on American society. What they don't realize is that the real problem is not Wall Street, it's the fusion of government in Wall Street, which the Democrats are just as much in favor of as the Republicans. Many of your big donors to the Democrat Party are going to be high-powered financiers on Wall Street. It's what they are. And they donate to both, but they donate to the Democrats too. Corporate America, which Jeffersonian America was very critical of, is highly invested in the Democrat Party and leftist woke politics. They love it. Coca-Cola, Major League Baseball, the NFL, all of these things. So the Jeffersonian tradition has been critical of all this stuff for a long time. And I think that's where people miss how vital this tradition is to American society and why the Abbeville Institute exists. But, we're told that we're just a bunch of lost causers who don't understand history, don't know anything about history. We're just a bunch of Southerners who just want to complain. But maybe it's the other way around. Maybe the myth of America is really the Lincolnian myth. It certainly is a refounding. I think Eric Foner was correct about this in saying, look, we had a new America created in 1865, 1866, 1868. A new America is being created. It's not the old America. We have something entirely new. And so in that way, Jefferson and Washington and Madison and Monroe, even John Marshall, Alexander Hamilton, all of those people really don't matter anymore, even though you can look at Lincoln and the intellectual trajectory of the Hamiltonian system, and then, of course, Hamiltonian America, which John Marshall was certainly a part of, Daniel Webster. That becomes Lincolnian America, and then on down the line. You can see a clear path that way. But Lincolnian America is even different from what Hamilton would have advocated for big government. So this is the amazing thing about all of it. And this is why when Bill Wilson, we published a piece that Bill Wilson, a speech that Bill Wilson gave in our 2013 summer school. We've been doing this since 2002. Our 2013 summer school on Robert E. Lee. And he said this, I really like this quote because it gets into the heart of what we do at the Institute and why it's so funny when people say we're revisionists and we just want to come up with fake history and all these things. He said this, quote, though we cannot saddle all admirers and all detractors of Robert E. Lee with these quotations, they do, I think, set forth the transformation of our picture of Lee, to use my title, from his time to ours. Southern Arthur, the brilliant but misguided alienated white supremacist who led his nation to utter ruin and completely destroyed his own army. So he was a Southern Arthur, a knight beyond reproach. And now he's described as a brilliant but misguided alienated white supremacist who led his nation to utter ruin and completely destroyed his own army. Well, think about that transformation. Nothing's changed in the history. What's changed? What's changed in American history? Not Lee himself. Lee hasn't changed. In fact, if you go read Douglas Southall Freeman's 4-volume biography of Robert E. Lee, he brings up everything that the detractors say about Lee. He covers it. None of this is new. The fact the Wesley Norris situation with Robert E. Lee, Freeman talks about that. His wrestling with slavery and other things, Freeman talks about that. He talks about all these things. But what's changed is our attitude of the past. That's what's changed. So we used to admire Robert E. Lee up through the 1950s, 60s, even in the 70s and early 80s. Robert E. Lee was someone to be admired. In the last 20 years, that's changed. And it's changed not because Lee has changed, but because we've changed. But because historians have become activists. It's changed because Americans have decided that Robert E. Lee does not represent modern American culture. Lee the man hasn't changed. So Wilson says, as Gallagher continued to say, everything that Lee loved and admired, he destroyed. Everything that Lee loved and admired, he destroyed. Did he destroy it? Did Lee destroy it? Or did Lincoln and his mercenaries destroy it? Who destroyed it? It wasn't Lee. Lee was fighting to keep it. Now, certainly prescient Southerners understood that secession might lead to the destruction of all these things. They said it. If you go back and read the Georgia secession convention debates, there was a discussion of this. If you really want to preserve all these things, then don't secede, because if we secede and we lose, they're gone. It's gone. The only way to protect what you're talking about secession protecting is to stay in the Union. Because if we leave, it's likely these things will be destroyed. So Wilson says, we can, of course, account for this transformation in part, but only in part, by reminding ourselves that history books are written by the victors. But there is another reason. The picture of Lee from his time is blocked from entirely entering ours. Modern historians for many decades now have used the celebrity of being on the right side of history, to use that despicable phrase, to claim that only the evidence they put forward is true evidence, and what is more, is the only evidence that can be true. They have the right to say what's evidence and what's not evidence. The power of winning translates into the power of pontificating our evidence. This is what an earlier lecture was called the Lost Cause School of History. Their warrant for this pronouncement is that any cogent case defending the Southern cause, including the nobility of her leaders, is merely a rearguard action to demonstrate that the South did not fight to maintain a slaveocracy, but for some other cause, be it states' rights, free trade, what have you. So see, this is it. If you say Lee was a great man, well then the other side, who are ideologically driven, by the way, they're not free and pure as the driven snow, that they're just objective historians looking at these things objectively, and we're deciding that what you're saying is just subjective. It's all opinion. We're doing things that are not based on opinion. We're looking at the evidence, and the evidence says that our position is right. So if you just say Robert E. Lee was a great man, Stonewall Jackson was a great man, oh my gosh, you're a lost causer. You're a lost causer who just wants to bring back slavery and segregation. Now, which argument is more sophomoric? I mean, that should be asked. If I said Robert E. Lee's a great man because this, and this. He's a Christian gentleman. He's an honorable man. His actions are honorable. Robert E. Lee lived a life that men in particular should look to emulate. But then your response to that is, well, then what do you want to do? Bring back slavery? You want to bring back Jim Crow? Which argument is sophomoric? Which argument is really that stupid? Well, I mean, we all know. Now, some would respond, well, but Lee was a traitor. He's not honorable. He's a traitor. A traitor to what? Which is more honorable, staying and fighting for your home state? We're seeing it now. When all these people are talking about Ukraine, we think the Ukrainians are honorable. They're fighting to defend their state against the imperial Russia, against an invasion by another people who at one point controlled Ukraine. So, I mean, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. The Russians controlled Ukraine. So the Russians say, well, that was ours, right? We controlled it. So this argument that, well, they weren't alien people. They weren't alien people. They're part of the United States. They're Americans. Okay, well, then you're saying these Southerners aren't Americans then, or I don't know. What are they? But if we're going to say that Lee was not honorable for defending his state against the central government, well, then you have to say the Ukrainians aren't honorable for defending their state against Russia, which at one time was the central government of Ukraine. Well, which one is right? This is the thing. We can admire Zelensky, but we can't admire Robert E. Lee. The men are drastically different when it comes to character. Lee is a much better man than Zelensky any day of the week. A much better man than Abraham Lincoln. So was Jefferson Davis, by the way. But this is the idiotic, sophomoric response that we get from the dopes who want to sound smart on social media. Well, if you say these things, you're just going to try to bring back slavery. And of course, by slavery, they don't even know what they're really talking about. They have an image of slavery that's generally fostered or developed by modern pop culture. And so for the next 6 weeks or so, we're going to run a series of essays by Clyde Wilson on, the title of it is African American Slavery in Historical Perspective. And the first installment of that ran this week, March 10th. And this might upset some people, and it might upset some people because Clyde is looking at this not from a presentist position, but from the actual time period itself in comparative history. And I think he does a very good job of this. We forget sometimes how powerful comparative history is. And I've mentioned it before. I can't remember if it's on this podcast, but there was a BBC program. This is really amazing. I've shown it on campus several times. There's a BBC program that didn't come out too long ago. And what they had were 6 major British actors and actresses, 3 men, 3 women. And they had to live, it's a reality show, they had to live like Londoners would have lived in Victorian England at various levels of the income strata, right? So they're cast in society. And in one episode, several episodes actually, they had to do some pretty nasty things. Filter trash, go through coal dust, go out and get dog crap out of the yard, out of the street so they could use it for tanning. Literally, this is what they had to do. They had to stay in the workhouses, which were horrible. And we forget in a workhouse, this was not shown in the show, but people were tortured in these workhouses. Working the wheel was something they had to do, which would power a mill so that they could make bread to use to sell. This is what, so you had to walk the wheel to just earn your keep, and among other things. And people would be whipped and tortured, essentially, in these workhouses. That doesn't sound very pleasant. Living in an urban environment in the 19th century was horrible. And we usually have another word for that. If you're being forced to work so that you can provide for yourself, we would call that something else in America, and it begins with an S. But they didn't call it that in Britain. They were enlightened. They were beyond that. They weren't going to have these horrible leftover things. But again, this goes back to the point I was making early on. You've got a Lincolnian myth, you've got a myth of America, and then you've got reality. And so the lost cause myth, in many ways, is reality. Just as Clyde Wilson's piece discussing these things, and he uses Eugene Genovese and Fogel and Engerman. He's not saying anything that hasn't been said before, or even by Clyde Wilson in other pieces at other times. He's not saying anything that's radical or that's radical departure from what historians were saying for years. It's only been the last 30 years or so that we've had this entirely detached discussion of slavery. And I think I've said it on this podcast. When I bought Fogel and Engerman's Time on the Cross several years ago, there was some papers inside the book that came with the book. I bought it online, came with the book. And they were papers from a Liberty Fund conference on slavery. And the man writing the papers talked about how contentious this conference was because people got so upset about this topic. It really drives people mad because they think somehow it reflects on them from something that happened over 150 years ago. It doesn't reflect on any of us today. And Clyde even brings it up. He has a line in this piece. He says, "None of us, I think, have a claim on current society for what may have happened to our forebears 8 or more generations ago." This is true. We can't control what happened 8 or more generations ago. We can't control what happened 4 generations ago. It's not us. That's what happened with people in society, but not us. We can control what happens now, but we can't control what happened that long ago, 8 generations, 4 generations. There's no control over that. So to blame people or lay guilt on people for these things is just absolutely ridiculous. This is exactly what people want to do. And so, again, one of the things we try to do at the Institute is bring these kind of things out, bring these discussions out in a way that gets people thinking about these topics. And so these next 6 weeks, we're going to have something every week from Clyde on this particular topic, and it's going to be really good. You're going to want to read these essays. And then, of course, we had a couple of really interesting pieces this week on Southern literature or place. The first is one of my favorite authors here at the Institute, Travis Holt, The Shadow of Red Rock. And I love one of these paragraphs. Actually, it's the last 2 paragraphs. He says, Red Rock Mountain looms in the beautiful late afternoon glow as I write this. Though I am several miles from seeing it, I can close my eyes and see it clearly. It stands as an eternal sentinel, overlooking the valley of my home and people. This land is ours. We earned it. Red Rock Mountain will always be a symbol of home and folk, blood and soil in a tangible form, easy to see at a glance. I think often of my great-grandfather, Wayne, who sparked this whole writing period in my life. He sat many a day, gazing to his right up at the dominating peak that he lived so near, on his beloved porch where he raised 5 children. He lived rough and had little, but thank God above all for all he had. His existence as a hardscrabble farmer was the typical story in the Ozarks, and to many seems like nothing special. But to those of us who came after, we owe everything to his perseverance. He lived and died under Red Rock Mountain, and knew his ancestors and all those before him and after him. He was truly a blessed man. I hope to leave my children the same legacy, knowing that beautiful red cliff shining in the morning sun means home. We are nothing without a connection to a place. God himself gave his children a place to call home. We should do the same for our children. Just a beautiful story about place. And we've lost that major connection. We've lost an understanding for what these things are. As Casey Chalk points out with Miami, it's just seen as a playground now. But Florida at one time was a real southern state, and Miami was a real complex southern place. And so if we don't understand the history and the stories of these things, we'll never really understand what that tradition is all about. And that's why the Institute exists. Because we want you to think about these things. If you live in these areas and you love the Southern tradition, all the good and bad about it, just to know it, it's a beautiful thing when you start finding that in your own people. And we've got a great essay next week on that topic, so I don't want to steal my thunder on that yet. But we hope over these last 300 episodes, the last 7 years that we've been doing the podcast, and since I came on to do more with the Institute in 2014, that started in April of 2014, so we're almost on the 8-year anniversary of me getting much more involved in the Institute. We hope in that time, and then in the 20 years the Institute has been around, we've so much stuff before I came on, that you've gained a better understanding, more appreciation for the Institute, for the Southern tradition, I should say, not just the Institute, but the Southern tradition, for the South, for what makes the South a truly beautiful part of American history. The Southern tradition, a viable and vital part of the South of America, and of course, at large, and everything we think of with America. That's something we're hoping to do with that 1607 project, and I mean, we hope you get involved with that and enjoy it when we do it, but we hope it's a game changer. As much of what we're doing, we keep growing all the time. And that, again, comes back to you as well. And so if you like everything we do, please share it around and make that call to donate to the Institute. That's how we keep going. All right. Hope you enjoyed this Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Until next time, good day.